and welcome to Round Robin. I'm your host, Robin McCormick with the Hampton City Marketing Department. And today we're going to talk about a topic that I know has been very big lately with our residents, and that is weather, storms, and flooding. My guest today is Bill Sammler from the National Weather Service. Welcome, Bill.
Thanks for having me.
This is unusual, the amount of rainfall and what they call 100-year or 200-year storms, to get them a whole lot more frequently, or at least back to back. So can you explain to me, first of all, what is this term 100-year storm or 200-year storm? What does that mean?
Basically, when folks talk about a 1 in 100-year event or 1 in 500-year event, it's a statistical estimate of how many times within that period you would most likely experience an event of that magnitude. So for those that really want to break it down, it doesn't really mean that you only might see one once every 100 years.
And don't you wish that? Because then,
right.
I might not even see one in my lifetime.
Well, then I might be out of a job because you could predict it.
That's right.
But the reality is it only means, for example, a 1 in 100-year event, that you have a 1% chance of that event happening in a given year. So every single year you have a chance for that happening, but the risk is pretty small.
So we had, two pretty darn big storms recently, 3 or 4 days apart. And one of the things, too, is the official measures, at Langley Air Force Base were, and you and I talked about this, something in the neighborhood of 8 inches over the 4-day period. Well, that's not that unusual. But in parts of Hampton, and particularly along Newmarket Creek, which is one of our vulnerable areas, it looked like maybe close to 15 inches.
Right, and that was 2 separate events, and 2 separate events that happened very quickly. And I think that's the important aspect of both those August events that people need to remember, and it could help differentiate those events from an Irene that dumped 10 to 12 inches of rain, or a Floyd that dumped 10 to 15 inches of rain on the city. And that is when you have 2 to 3 inch per hour rainfall rates occurring for 2 to 3 hours at a time, you're dumping enormous amounts of water in a very short period of time in a drainage system that, regardless of where you are in Hampton Roads, is not designed to handle it.
Right.
And so you're going to get much more significant flooding than you normally would from a storm that would produce 2 to 3 inches of rain in an hour and a half, or an inch of rain in an hour.
Right, so it's not even just the total rainfall, it's not even just the 15 inches, which is a huge number.
Right.
It is that it pretty much was 7 inches here in a 3-hour period, and then 7 inches again in a 3-hour period. I mean, it was a lot at one time.
That is absolutely correct. If you had that 15 inches occurring over 2.5 days, the magnitude of the flooding would have been different. Would you have had street flooding? Absolutely.
Sure.
Could you have potentially had flooding of some businesses or homes? Possibly, depending upon what the tides were doing at the same time. But would you have had it happen as quickly and with the magnitude that it occurred, because those 2 events happened in such a short period of time? Probably not.
And the repeat factor, I mean, really, the waterways just didn't have time to go down in between. I mean, I walked in my backyard and it was like walking on a sponge. I mean, the system, the ecological system just couldn't process that much, even after a day or two, really.
Right, and that's not necessarily a function of the tides, it's a function of how much water can the ground hold. And if you have one of those big events when the ground is dry, sometimes you'll get less flooding with the same event that would occur if the soil's wet. And having those 2 events in some cases occur over the same area within a 3 or 4 day period really doesn't allow the soil to dry out enough so it can absorb. So my guess is that the fact that the soil was still wet on that second event, which I believe was August 28th, probably hurt and exacerbated the flooding that occurred vice that earlier event a few days beforehand.
So let me ask you a question. I realize this is speculation, but is it just that there was this freak event where we had 2 100-year storms in 4 days, or do we feel like something weather-wise, meteorological is going on that is making these things happen more frequently?
I think those 2 events were freak events. Why they focused themselves on the peninsula and why they focused themselves in the area of Hampton, Newport News, York County, I really don't know. If, for example, we go through a 10 or 15 year period and we have 5 or 6 more of these events, maybe then something is actually going on larger in the atmosphere than we think. My guess is, though, that these were 2 events that frequently occurred back to back within a 1 week period.
Okay, so that gets to the question people have, like, can't you fix it? Well, if it is a freakish act of nature, you really can't fix it. It's not worth the cost, potentially, of making the kind of change you'd have to make to mitigate that damage. But I will say that other people in Hampton and throughout Hampton Roads are saying, I didn't used to flood when we had a storm like this, and now I'm flooding. What could be some of the causes for that? Or is it, again, really freakish and perception?
Well, part of it might be perception, but there may be some factors that could be influencing what's going on. One of them that is true regardless of where we are in the United States is development. When you start to remove soil and pave it over with concrete or asphalt, or you build houses, apartment complexes, shopping centers, you change how that water is going to drain. No longer does at least some of it get absorbed into the soil. It falls on the concrete and it drains. So now you have a larger volume of water that the drainage system has to handle.
Right.
The other aspect
and that's like over a 25, 50-year period, you look at that trend.
Right, but each time you do that, you add to the problem because you have less and less available soil to absorb the moisture. The other aspect of it is there is something going on in Hampton Roads that's somewhat unique to the Mid-Atlantic region, and that is land subsidence. And we talk about sea level rise, or I prefer to call it sea level change, because of that non-climate component that is occurring here in the Mid-Atlantic region and Hampton Roads in particular, and that the soil is actually, or the land is actually falling.
So when you say land subsidence, you mean the level of land is going down, whatever that is. That compacting? Is it way geological underground change?
Right, it's geological,
okay.
And there are a couple of reasons for it. And as a meteorologist, I don't fully understand them, but I do know that land subsidence is occurring at a fairly steady rate. And the scientists that have looked at this say it's going to continue. Regardless of whatever happens climate-wise, this land subsidence is going to continue. So, while it's a very small fraction of an inch in a year's time, you add that up over 25 or 30 years, and now you're talking about, several inches.
Right. So when you look at those sea level change numbers, and they have the national numbers do suggest that Hampton Roads is changing faster than almost anywhere else. That includes the actual sea level rise from climate change or whatever you think is causing that, but the actual measurement, but it includes the land going down as well, which makes our gap bigger than some other places.
Than a lot of other places.
Almost anywhere else, okay.
Right, there are a few places where that sea level change is occurring as quickly as it is in Hampton Roads, and it's because of that second factor.
Gotcha. No one's talking about. I haven't heard much about it. Maybe you scientists are talking about it, and it just hasn't trickled down to the average
Well,
folk.
if folks want to learn a little bit more, there was a report done by the Virginia Institute of Marine Sciences a couple of years ago, and if they just Google VIMS sea level change study, they should be able to get the report. It's in PDF form, and while it's somewhat technical, it does go into the fact that there are 2 things going on contributing to the more rapid sea level change than we see elsewhere, not only in the United States, but around the globe.
Well, this really points to not something that Hampton can do alone, but this is a regional problem and a regional challenge, what do you do about that? How do you prepare for it or counteract it, or what are the options?
And actually, I think the word challenge is the perfect word, because it is a challenge. What do we do? How do we mitigate the potential effects long term? Because we're not talking about something that's immediate, the next 6 months or a year.
Right.
We're talking about 25, 50, 100 years down the road, where the profile of the land and how flooding impacts it is going to be very different than it is today.
Interesting. So what else? Tell me any other weather trends or challenges, or what is going on out there for our weather?
Well, there are always challenges that occur in Hampton Roads, and I think really Virginia is an area that presents some really unique challenges because of where it resides relative to the mountains, relative to the oceans. And so we always have to look at what in a particular weather situation, what contribution the ocean is going to have, what contribution, for example, in a winter storm, cold air from Canada is going to have. And that battleground that we hear about so often in the wintertime is somewhat unique to Hampton Roads and really the eastern half of Virginia, and does present some really interesting challenges to forecasters on a yearly basis.
Well, it used to be that I could say, I'm from Ohio, at least we don't have tornadoes. Like, you get a long warning on a hurricane, but the tornadoes don't pop up, and yet they have in the past, whatever it's been, 3 or 4 years. You've had Suffolk, you've had Gloucester, you've had the one in Hampton this summer. Well, is there anything that's causing that again, or does that seem to be a trend, or is it too soon to tell?
I don't know that there's a trend. If you look nationwide, and I think it's always more useful to look broadly than it is to look close in.
Yeah, see, I only care about Hampton, but go on.
well, but I mean, if you want to look at it from a trend perspective,
right.
Some folks have actually looked at what is the difference in tornado numbers now versus, say, 30 years ago. And virtually every study that's been done suggests that the stronger tornadoes, the EF2 tornadoes on up to the EF5 tornadoes, those have basically flatlined. There's really not been any change in the actual numbers. Where the change has been is in the weaker, the EF0 and EF1s.
Oh.
And part of that has to do with Doppler radar. Part of that has to do with development again. There are more people in places that there weren't 30, 40, 50 years ago that are experiencing damage.
Now wait, so you're saying these things might have always been there, but because it was vacant land, no one noticed, or because Doppler wasn't there to measure it, no one could say it was a weak tornado versus a bad storm.
Part of it is that, and then there's a third factor. And that is, we're doing a better job now than 30 years ago of being able to go out and look at damage and say, that was a tornado or that was straight line wind. And I believe that if you went back into the records, the 60s, 70s, and 80s, there were events that were labeled wind that were actually tornadoes.
There were bad storms. We just didn't recognize or couldn't confirm that it was actually a tornado.
Right, and we didn't do the type of surveys that are pretty routine now after a tornado event.
So some of it then may be perception. It just may be there's not more damage, it's just we're able to label it as a tornado, whereas we might not have been before.
That's part of it, but I think people's perception may be correct from the perspective that if you look at the Suffolk tornado and the Gloucester tornado, you had two pretty strong tornadoes in a 3-year period. That doesn't happen very often. It certainly can and probably has in the historical record happen, but it just, if you expand that horizon out 15, 20 years, that really hasn't happened in that 15, 20-year period before.
And so it could just be, again, just whatever caused that. It doesn't mean there's more coming or that there's a big change. It just was, wow, that's unusual.
Sure, and let's take 2012 as a great example. We started out with a pretty active tornado season, January, February, March. Really active. People were concerned that we were going to have a repeat of the huge number of tornadoes we had in 2011.
Right, across the country, you're saying here, right.
Well, we've been really quiet nationwide since really the middle of April. And I think we're now on the low end of what's happened the last 10 or 15 years in terms of total number of tornadoes. So, while the perception early on in the season, may have been, we got a 2011 repeat. The reality is we're nowhere near that.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's helpful that you look at things from a scientific perspective and over a period of time and over a larger geographical region, because I think some of us who are just average citizens go, wow, we've had 2 of these. This means, disaster and doom for the future or something like that. And you're able to step back and say, maybe it means we'll get more, maybe it doesn't. We have to observe over a longer period of time and see.
And I think that's the difference between the scientific side, where you have a little bit of longer term perspective, and by longer term, 100 years is a long term, versus somebody's individual perspective that might have been here 5, 10, 15, 20 years, who may not have had that sort of experience that folks that have lived here 60 or 70 years have had.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, and those people might say, at least, well, yeah, I got flooded out twice in a short period of time, but they're able to put it maybe in a little more perspective. But again, it is very scary to people. And, if you look at sea level change of 3-4 inches, it doesn't sound much, but if you look at the difference 3 or 4 inches of flooding makes, it's your front step or it's into your house. I mean,
exactly.
It's a big deal.
Exactly, and I think long term, that's the issue, is the impact is going to change. Do we exactly know how it's going to change? No, but we know it's going to change long term. And then the question is, how do we adapt, or how do we mitigate that impact?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a big challenge.
Huge challenge. And not one I think that, first of all, people really have their arms wrapped around yet, and also not one that I think you'd get a lot of agreement on from a large number of people.
Right.
Because it's a complex issue. Very
complex issue. And some of the fixes are going to be very, very expensive. And so how do we make those decisions?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, you can look at places along the coast, even in North Carolina, where folks have chosen to mitigate that impact by raising their homes. That's one option. Mm-hmm. You look at that on a large scale, 100 homes, 1,000 homes, 10,000 homes, you're ringing the cash register really quickly. So really, what is the option in terms of doing this cost effectively over the long term? That's very, very difficult.
Well, the other question I had, when the streets were flooded and it was a very bad rainfall in a very short part of time, I looked around at people, and you know what? They expected to be able to go anywhere they wanted to go, even in a pretty monstrous short-term storm. And I think some of that is the expectation level change. It may be that if that happened 50 years ago, people sat at home or stayed at work or went to see a friend and didn't have that expectation that I can go out and get takeout for dinner, and that I can get home, and that, life should be normal in a pretty extraordinary situation.
Right, and maybe having events like this puts into people's mindset that, well, there might be a period here where life isn't normal, and I've got to adjust to that.
Right.
So could there be a silver lining?
Society,
no, we don't. No, we don't.
And I think that has to be part of the cure too, is to be able to say, recognize that this is abnormal. Don't drive through that road when you can't see the yellow stripe. That's
right.
A sign that the water's too deep.
That's exactly right.
So
and if
stay where you are. Go find a place.
And if that water's moving, that's big trouble.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't take a lot of moving water to take a vehicle out of the driver's control and into the control of the current. And
well, we saw that.
That's right. And as we've all seen, once that vehicle goes into the control of the current, your chances of survival can go down pretty quickly. Mm-hmm. The other thing, and I think this is really important for people to understand, we've all seen swiftwater rescues on TV. If you're caught in that sort of situation, not only are you and whomever else is in that vehicle are now in a life-threatening situation, but anybody that comes to respond and rescue you is also in that same sort of life-threatening situation. So it's no longer just your problem. It's somebody else's problem as well. And I think we have to be cognizant of that fact as well.
That's great. And that's a good reminder and a cautionary tale, too, for people in the future, is to learn from what we experienced recently and to maybe change their life while we look forward and look at longer term ways to maybe not solve the problem, but at least mitigate what we can.
Yes, and patience can be a virtue. You know, 2,
Gosh, that's
3,
a
4
hard
hours,
thing.
it is very hard. And being an impatient person myself, I completely relate to that. But it's one of those things that you know, if you really want to try and ease the stress in that sort of situation, patience can be your best friend.
That's right. Well, thank you for leaving us with that reminder. And Bill, it's been great talking with you. It's a little scary. You're not sugarcoating this situation.
No, but knowledge is power. And if people understand that they do have some power with this in terms of how they make their decisions, I think it'll be easier for them should another significant flood situation, a significant hurricane, nor'easter, et cetera, visit Hampton.
Okay. Well, thank you, Bill. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Robin.
And thank you for watching this episode of Round Robin.